Grace Campbell had protected Justin Bieber for 10 years. From stalkers, from industry predators, from his own worst impulses. But when the old church in Stratford began to reveal its secrets, she realized some threats couldn't be handled with security teams or legal agreements. Some battles required the ancestral spiritual power she'd inherited from generations of Caribbean warriors. The black Escalade crunched through the snow-covered streets of Stratford, Ontario, as Justin Bieber gazed out at the small town that had launched him to global superstardom. At 29, he was worth over $300 million, owned mansions on 3 continents, and could fill stadiums anywhere in the world. But something about returning to his hometown always made him feel like the awkward 13-year-old who used to busk on these very streets. "You sure about this project, Mr. Justin?" Grace Campbell asked from the passenger seat, her lilting Jamaican accent carrying decades of wisdom and concern. At 55, she'd been Justin's head housekeeper and personal manager for 10 years, watching him navigate the treacherous waters of fame, fortune, and growing up in the public eye. Grace had started working for the Bieber family when Justin was still a teenager, fresh off his first major record deal and overwhelmed by sudden wealth. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, she'd immigrated to Canada in her 20s, working her way up through domestic service until she'd built a reputation as someone who could handle the most demanding celebrity households. But Justin was different from her other employers, more sensitive, more spiritual, and surprisingly humble despite his astronomical success. "I need to do this, Grace," Justin replied, his breath fogging the window as he spoke. "This town gave me everything. It's time I gave something back." The something was an ambitious renovation project that had been consuming Justin's thoughts for months. He'd purchased the old St. James Anglican Church, a Gothic revival building dating back to 1870 that had been abandoned for nearly a decade. His plan was to convert it into a state-of-the-art recording studio and community arts center, a place where local musicians could create and young people could learn. Grace studied the building as they pulled into the empty parking lot. Even in daylight, there was something unsettling about the structure. The stone walls were stained with age and weather, several windows were boarded up, and the bell tower reached toward the gray winter sky like an accusatory finger. But it was more than just the building's deteriorated condition that bothered her. It was an atmosphere of sadness and unrest that seemed to cling to the very stones. "My grandmother always told me to be careful around old churches," Grace said quietly. "She said some places hold on to the emotions of everyone who ever prayed there, cried there, or died there." Justin glanced at her with interest. Grace rarely talked about her family's spiritual beliefs, though he'd noticed over the years that she had an uncanny ability to sense trouble before it arrived. Her warnings had saved him from bad business deals, toxic relationships, and dangerous situations more times than he could count. "What kind of emotions are you sensing here?" he asked. Grace was quiet for a moment, studying the building with the focused attention of someone reading invisible signs. "Grief," she said finally. "Old grief that never healed, and anger. Someone died in there with a lot of rage in their heart." The renovation crew was already at work inside the church, their voices and power tools echoing through the vaulted space. Justin had hired the best contractors money could buy, along with historical preservationists, to ensure the building's architectural integrity was maintained. The plan was to gut the interior while preserving the Gothic details, creating a recording studio that would be both cutting-edge and respectful of the building's heritage. "Mr. Bieber." The foreman, a burly man named Dave Morrison, approached with blueprints in his hands. "Good to see you. We've made some interesting discoveries since we started work." "What kind of discoveries?" Justin asked, though Grace noticed he glanced at her nervously. "Well, we found some old records in the basement. Church documents, ledgers, that sort of thing. And there's a sealed room behind the altar that isn't on any of the original blueprints. Looks like it might have been walled up sometime in the early 1900s. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Canadian winter. In her grandmother's teachings, Sealed rooms in sacred buildings were almost never a good sign. They usually meant someone had wanted to hide something or trap something inside. "We also found this," Dave continued, producing a small, tarnished silver cross. It was embedded in the wall behind the altar like someone had driven it in there deliberately. Grace reached for the cross before she could stop herself, and the moment her fingers touched the metal, she jerked her hand back as if she'd been burned. The cross radiated a cold energy that spoke of desperation, terror, and a final act of protection against something unspeakably evil. "Don't touch that," she said sharply, surprising both Justin and Dave with the authority in her voice. "That's not decoration. That's a ward. Someone put that there to keep something contained." Dave looked confused, but Justin had learned to trust Grace's instincts implicitly. "What should we do with it?" he asked. "Leave it exactly where you found it," Grace replied firmly. "And don't open that sealed room. Not yet." But as they spoke, they could hear sounds from the basement. The renovation crew was already working on opening the mysterious chamber, their excited voices echoing up through the floor. "Too late for that, I'm afraid," Dave said apologetically. "My guys started on it this morning. Should have it open within the hour." Grace grabbed Justin's arm, her fingers digging into his expensive coat with surprising strength. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "Right now, before they finish opening that room." "Grace, what's wrong? You're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared. My grandmother taught me about places like this. Buildings where the dead refused to rest because of injustices that were never resolved. Opening that room is like removing a cork from a bottle full of poison." Before Justin could respond, the sounds from the basement changed. The construction noise stopped abruptly, replaced by excited voices and then something else. A low moaning that seemed to come from the very foundations of the building, growing louder and more anguished with each passing second. The temperature in the church began to drop rapidly, their breath becoming visible as frost started forming on the windows. And underneath the moaning, they could hear what sounded like voices, dozens of them, crying out in languages that predated the building itself. "What the hell is happening?" Dave shouted over the growing cacophony. Grace was already pulling Justin toward the exit, but as they reached the heavy wooden doors, they slammed shut with a thunderous bang. Justin threw his full weight against them, but they wouldn't budge, not because they were locked, but because some invisible force was holding them closed. They were trapped inside with whatever had been sealed away for over a century. Grace Campbell had protected Justin Bieber from stalkers, from industry predators, from his own worst impulses. But when the old church in Stratford began to reveal its secrets, she realized some threats couldn't be handled with security teams or legal agreements. The renovation crew emerged from the basement in a panic, their faces pale with shock and confusion. Dave Morrison, the foreman, was clutching a manila folder filled with old documents, his hands shaking as he approached Justin and Grace. "You need to see these," he said, his voice barely steady. "We found them in that sealed room, along with other things." Grace took the folder with reluctant hands, her spiritual senses already telling her that whatever they contained would explain the malevolent energy she'd been feeling since arriving at the church. The papers were old and brittle, dating back to the early 1900s, but the handwriting was still legible. The first document was a letter from Reverend Thomas Whitmore, dated March 15, 1903. "I can no longer in good conscience remain silent about the horrors that have taken place within these sacred walls. Father Mackenzie's actions toward the Indigenous children brought to our care have been an abomination in the eyes of God. When I confronted him about his treatment of young Mary Crow, Feather, and the others, he threatened my life. I fear for my safety, but I cannot allow these sins to go unpunished." Justin looked up from the letter with growing horror. "This is about a residential school?" Grace nodded grimly, pieces of a terrible puzzle falling into place. "Many churches, in Canada had operated residential schools in the early 1900s, institutions supposedly designed to civilize Indigenous children by separating them from their families and cultures. But in reality, these schools had been sites of systematic abuse, cultural genocide, and often death. "Keep reading," she said quietly. The next document was a report from a local doctor describing injuries to several children that were inconsistent with normal childhood accidents. Then came a letter from a government inspector noting unusual numbers of deaths at the church-run school and requesting a formal investigation. But the most chilling document was the final letter from Reverend Whitmore, dated just 3 days later. "Father Mackenzie has sealed me in the basement chamber, claiming I am suffering from religious mania. He intends to let me die here while he destroys the evidence of his crimes. I have placed a ward upon this room, blessed with all the power of my faith, to contain the evil that has infected this place. May God forgive us all for what we allowed to happen to those innocent children." Grace closed the folder, her hands trembling with rage and sorrow. The spiritual energy she'd been sensing wasn't just old grief. It was the concentrated anguish of children who had been tortured and murdered within these walls, and the guilt of those who had tried too late to stop it. How many children died? Here, Justin asked, his voice hollow. Dave Morrison answered reluctantly. "According to the records we found, at least 30 over a 5-year period, but there are suggestions that the real number was much higher. The temperature in the church continued to drop, and the voices they'd been hearing were becoming more distinct." Grace could make out words now, children calling for their mothers in languages she didn't understand, pleading for help that never came. "Mr. Bieber," one of the construction workers called out urgently, "you need to see what else we found in that room." Against her better judgment, Grace followed Justin down to the basement. The sealed chamber had been a small room, probably originally used for storage, but what they discovered inside made it clear it had served a much darker purpose in its final years. That the walls were covered with scratches, hundreds of them, carved by desperate fingernails. Some formed recognizable patterns, crosses, symbols that might have been Indigenous spiritual markings, and what looked like calendars marking the passage of hopeless days. In one corner, they found a small pile of bones that the construction crew had initially assumed were animal remains, but Grace's trained eye recognized them for what they were: the skeletal remains of children, some so small they could only have belonged to toddlers. "My God," Justin whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Those poor babies." But it was what they found in the center of the room that explained the supernatural activity. Carved deep into the stone floor was a large circle surrounded by symbols that Grace recognized from her grandmother's teachings about protective magic. Within the circle lay the mummified remains of a man in clerical collar, Reverend Whitmore, who had sealed himself into the room to contain the evil he couldn't otherwise stop. His skeletal hands still clutched a silver cross identical to the one they'd found embedded in the wall upstairs, and around his neck hung a leather pouch containing what appeared to be salt, herbs, and other materials used in spiritual protection rituals. "He knew," Grace said softly. "He understood that Father Mackenzie had become something more than human evil, something that needed to be magically contained." As if responding to her words, the supernatural activity in the church intensified. Doors began slamming throughout the building. The temperature dropped below freezing, and the voices of the dead children rose to a heartbreaking crescendo of pain and fury. And then, emerging from the shadows at the far end of the basement, they saw him. Father Mackenzie appeared exactly as he must have in life. A tall, imposing man in black clerical robes, but his eyes burned with an unholy light, and his presence radiated the kind of malevolence that could corrupt souls and twist faith into something monstrous. "Who dares disturb my rest?" he demanded, his voice echoing with supernatural authority. Grace stepped protectively in front of Justin, her hand instinctively reaching for the small leather pouch she wore around her neck, a gift from her grandmother, containing protective herbs and blessed salt. "You're not resting," she replied firmly. "You're trapped here by the weight of your own sins, and these children aren't at peace because of what you did to them." Father Mackenzie's ghostly form seemed to grow larger and more menacing. "Those children were heathens, barely human. I was doing God's work, civilizing savage souls." "You were murdering babies," Justin said, finding his voice despite his terror. "There's nothing sacred about what you did." The priest's attention turned to Justin, and Grace could see him evaluating the young man with predatory interest. "Ah, the famous singer. I know who you are, boy. You've made your fortune corrupting young minds with your music, leading them away from righteous paths. You're no better than I was." It was a psychological attack designed to create doubt and guilt, but Grace had dealt with similar spiritual manipulation before. "Don't listen to him," she told Justin firmly. "He's trying to make you complicit in his evil. Your music brings joy to people. It's the opposite of what he did here." But Father Mackenzie wasn't finished. With a gesture of his hand, the basement chamber began to fill with the ghostly forms of the children who had died within these walls. But these weren't the innocent spirits Grace had expected. They had been twisted by decades of rage and pain into something vengeful and dangerous. "My children," the priest said mockingly. "See how they've grown in death? See how hatred has made them strong?" The child's spirits moved toward Justin and Grace with murderous intent, their small faces distorted with supernatural fury. Grace realized that Father Mackenzie had found a way to corrupt even his victims, turning their justified anger into a weapon he could control. This was worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just a case of restless spirits seeking justice. It was active evil that had been feeding on innocent suffering for over a century, growing stronger and more twisted with each passing year. And now it had been released from its century-long prison, with only Grace's spiritual knowledge standing between it and two more victims. The renovation of the church was supposed to be Justin's passion project, converting sacred space into creative sanctuary. But Grace's Jamaican grandmother had taught her to recognize places where the dead refused to rest, and this was definitely one of them. Grace reached into her purse and pulled out a small bottle of blessed oil that she'd carried for protection, ever since her grandmother had given it to her decades ago. The elderly woman had been a practitioner of Obeah, the traditional spiritual system of Jamaica that blended African, Indigenous, and Christian elements into powerful protective magic. "Stay behind me," Grace commanded Justin, uncapping the bottle and anointing her forehead with the oil while speaking words in Jamaican patois that had been passed down through generations. Father Mackenzie laughed, but there was uncertainty in the sound. "Your heathen magic has no power here, woman. This is consecrated ground." "Consecrated ground that you defiled with the blood of innocents," Grace replied, her voice growing stronger as she connected with the spiritual power her ancestors had cultivated. "Your evil canceled out any holiness this place ever had." She began to walk in a circle around Justin, sprinkling salt from her protective pouch while chanting in a mixture of Jamaican patois and English. It was a binding ritual her grandmother had taught her, designed to create a protective barrier against malevolent spirits. "Me granny teach me say, evil spirit no cross salt line blessed with righteous anger," she said, her accent becoming thicker as she drew on ancestral power. "And me have plenty righteous anger for what you do to these babies." The child's spirits slowed their advance, confused by the spiritual energy Grace was projecting. Unlike Father Mackenzie's corrupted evil, her power came from a tradition of protection and healing that had helped enslaved people survive centuries of oppression. "These children aren't your weapons," she told the priest firmly. "They're victims, just like the people my ancestors protected from monsters like you." Justin watched in amazement as Grace seemed to grow taller and more commanding. her presence filling with an authority that had nothing to do with earthly power and everything to do with spiritual strength accumulated across generations. "You think your primitive superstitions can challenge the power of the church?" Father Mackenzie snarled. "The church?" Grace laughed bitterly. "You never represented the church. You represented the same evil that tried to destroy my people in Jamaica, that stole these children from their families, that convinced good people to look the other way while monsters did their work." She reached into her bag again and pulled out a small wooden cross, carved with symbols that blended Christian and African spiritual traditions. "But me, Granny, also teach me that love stronger than hate, that protection stronger than destruction, and that the ancestors always watching over those who remember them proper." The child's spirits were becoming less aggressive, their forms flickering between the twisted shapes Father Mackenzie had made them and the innocent souls they had been in life. Grace's protective magic was giving them a choice: continue serving their abuser or find peace. One by one, they began to turn away from the priest, their forms becoming brighter and more peaceful as they reclaimed their true nature. Grace could see them clearly now. Beautiful Indigenous children with round faces and dark eyes, no longer twisted by pain but glowing with the spiritual strength of their own traditions. "No!" Father Mackenzie roared, his form becoming more substantial. As his rage grew, "You belong to me. I made you what you are." But the children were no longer listening. They had found something stronger than his corruption: the memory of love, family, and cultural identity that no amount of abuse could truly destroy. "They never belonged to you," Grace said firmly. "Children belong to the Creator, to their families, to their communities, not to monsters who steal them in the night." The priest lunged toward her, his ghostly hands reaching for her throat, but Grace was ready. She held up her wooden cross and spoke words in an African language so old that even she didn't fully understand their meaning. Words her grandmother had taught her for moments when only the deepest magic would suffice. The cross blazed with golden light, and Father Mackenzie's form recoiled as if burned. But he wasn't defeated. He was drawing power from the evil that had been accumulating in this place for over a century. "Justin," Grace called urgently, "I need you to help me. What can I do? I don't know anything about this spiritual stuff." "You know about music, about bringing joy to people's hearts. That's a kind of magic too." She was right, and Justin realized it instinctively. Music had always been his way of connecting with something larger than himself, of touching the divine through melody and rhythm. "Sing," Grace commanded. "Sing something that brings hope, something that reminds these children of love instead of pain." Justin's voice was shaky at first, but as he began to sing, not one of his hit songs, but a simple hymn he remembered from his own childhood, the spiritual atmosphere in the basement began to shift. His music carried no commercial calculation, no celebrity polish, just the pure intention to bring comfort to suffering souls. The child's spirits gathered around him, their forms becoming brighter and more peaceful with each note. They remembered music, too, lullabies their mothers had sung, traditional songs of their people, the simple joy of children's voices raised in play. Father Mackenzie was growing weaker, his power diminishing as his victims reclaimed their innocence and found peace. But he made one last desperate attack, lunging not at Grace but at Justin, attempting to possess the young man's body and use his fame and wealth to spread evil in the modern world. Grace threw herself between them, taking the full force of the priest's malevolent energy into her own body. She screamed as supernatural cold and hatred flooded through her, but she didn't let go of her protective cross or stop chanting her grandmother's words of power. "You want to possess someone," she gasped through the pain. "Try taking someone who's been protected by 4 generations of Caribbean spiritual warriors. See how that works for you." What followed was a battle that took place on levels beyond physical reality. Grace's consciousness wrestled with Father Mackenzie's corrupted soul in a realm where ancestral power met centuries of accumulated evil. She could feel her grandmother's presence, and her great-grandmother's, and all the women in her family line who had learned to fight spiritual battles against oppression and abuse. The priest had power, but it was hollow power built on causing pain to others. Grace's strength came from a tradition of protection, healing, and community resistance that had sustained her people through the worst horrors human beings could inflict on each other. In the end, love proved stronger than hate. Father Mackenzie's form began to disintegrate. Not destroyed, but transformed. The evil burned away by Grace's spiritual fire, leaving only a confused and frightened soul who finally understood the magnitude of his crimes. What have I done?" he whispered, his voice now carrying genuine horror instead of arrogant malice. "You hurt children," Grace said simply, her voice gentle now that the battle was won. "But it's not too late for repentance if you're sincere about it." The child's spirits gathered around their former tormentor, but not for revenge. They offered him something he had never given them: forgiveness, conditional on his commitment to making amends for his crimes. "Help us find peace," one of the children said in a voice like wind through grass. "Help our families know what happened to us. Help the living learn from our story so this never happens again." Father Mackenzie nodded, tears streaming down his ghostly face. Yes, I'll do whatever I can to make this right." Grace had always known Justin was different from other celebrities, more sensitive, more connected to spiritual energies. But in the basement of the old Stratford church, those same sensitivities made him a target for forces that had been waiting decades for someone to hear their pain. The supernatural confrontation had left everyone in the basement drained and emotionally overwhelmed. The construction crew was huddled together, trying to process what they had witnessed, while Justin sat against a wall with tears streaming down his face. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming grief he'd absorbed from the child. Spirits. Grace knelt beside him, her own body still trembling from the spiritual battle she'd just fought. "You okay, baby?" she asked softly, reverting to the maternal tone she'd used when he was a teenager struggling with sudden fame. "Those children," Justin whispered. "I could feel their pain, Grace. All of it. How could anyone do that to innocent kids?" "Same way people always have," Grace replied sadly. "By convincing themselves that some lives matter less than others. By using power to hurt instead of protect." The child's spirits hadn't departed completely. They lingered in the basement, but their presence now felt peaceful rather than threatening. Grace could see them clearly. Dozens of Indigenous children ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, all bearing the cultural markers of various First Nations tribes from across Ontario. One of them, a girl who appeared to be about 10 years old, approached Grace with shy curiosity. "You have strong medicine," the child said in accented English, "like our elders had before the priests came." "Different medicine, same purpose," Grace replied. "My people learned to protect ourselves from those who would steal our children too." The girl nodded with the wisdom of someone who had experienced far too much in her brief life. "Will you help us go home? We've been trapped here so long, we forgot how to find our way back to our families." Grace looked around at the dozens of child spirits and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. These weren't just random ghosts. They were specific children from specific communities, and they deserved to be returned to their people with dignity and respect. "We'll find a way," she promised. "But first, we need to deal with this place properly." Justin had been listening to the conversation, and Grace could see his mind working through the implications. He was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had global influence, and, more importantly, had a heart that genuinely cared about justice for the marginalized. "We're not building a recording studio here," he said firmly. "This needs to be a memorial, a place where people can learn what really happened and honor these children's memory." "That's going to be expensive," Dave Morrison pointed out practically, "and complicated. There'll be government red tape, Indigenous land rights issues, historical preservation requirements." "I don't care about the cost," Justin replied. "And We'll work with Indigenous communities to make sure we do this right. These kids deserve better than what they got in life. They're going to get it in death." Grace felt a surge of pride in the young man she'd helped raise. This was why she'd devoted 10 years of her life to protecting him. Not because of his fame or wealth, but because of moments like this when his basic decency shone through. Father Mackenzie's spirit approached them hesitantly, his form now appearing as he must have before corruption consumed his soul. A middle-aged man with kind eyes and genuine remorse etched into his features. "There are records," he said quietly. "Hidden records that I kept, documenting which children came from which communities. I hid them in the walls of my office when I realized what I had become. If you can find those documents, we can reunite them with their families," Grace finished. "Even in death, they can go home." The search for Father Mackenzie's hidden records took 3 days, with Justin's renovation crew carefully dismantling sections of wall under the guidance of the priest's spirit. What they found was heartbreaking but crucial. Detailed records of 47 Indigenous children who had died at the residential school between 1898 and 1905, complete with their original names, tribal affiliations, and family information. Grace worked with Indigenous elders from across Ontario to identify the children and arrange for proper spiritual ceremonies to help them find peace. Each child needed to be honored according to the traditions of their specific tribe, with their names restored and their stories told to their descendants. The process took months, but Justin spared no expense. He flew in elders and traditional healers, funded genealogical research to track down surviving family members, and worked with government officials to ensure that the truth about the residential school was officially acknowledged. When the church organ began playing by itself at 3 a.m., Grace understood that her years of protecting Justin had been preparation for this moment. Some battles required more than earthly strength. They required the ancestral power she'd inherited from generations of Caribbean spiritual warriors. But now, 6 months after that terrifying night in the church basement, the organ played different music. Instead of the discordant sounds of trapped souls, it now played gentle melodies, lullabies, and traditional songs that helped guide the child's spirits home to their families. The St. James Church Memorial and Education Center had become a place of healing rather than haunting. Working with Indigenous communities, Justin had transformed the building into a living monument that honored the children who had died there while educating visitors about the broader history of residential schools in Canada. The main sanctuary now housed a series of exhibits telling the stories of each child who had died at the school. Their real names were displayed prominently, along with photographs of their tribal communities and information about their cultural traditions. Interactive displays allowed visitors to hear traditional songs, see examples of Indigenous art and crafts, and understand the richness of the cultures that residential schools had tried to destroy. Grace had been appointed as the memorial's spiritual coordinator, working with Indigenous elders to ensure that the building maintained appropriate energy and that any lingering spirits were treated with respect and dignity. Her Caribbean spiritual traditions had proven remarkably compatible with Indigenous practices. Both cultures understood the importance of honoring ancestors and maintaining connection between the living and the dead. The last of them went home. "Yesterday," she told Justin as they walked through the peaceful sanctuary. Little Mary Crow Feather, her great-great-granddaughter, came from Manitoba to perform the ceremony. "How do you feel?" Justin asked. "Knowing they're all at peace now?" Grace smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Like we did what we were supposed to do. Like maybe my grandmother's spirits guided us here for this purpose." The memorial had attracted international attention, not because of Justin's involvement, but because of its innovative approach to addressing historical trauma. Survivors of other residential schools had begun coming to Stratford to share their stories, and the memorial had become a model for similar projects across Canada and the United States. But perhaps most importantly, the building no longer felt haunted. The oppressive spiritual atmosphere had been replaced by something Grace's grandmother would have recognized as good energy. The feeling that came from honoring the dead properly and ensuring their stories would never be forgotten, Justin had used his platform to bring global attention to the history of residential schools, working with Indigenous activists and educators to create documentary films, museum exhibits, and educational programs. The recording studio he'd originally planned had been built elsewhere in Stratford, but this memorial had become his most important creative project. "You know what I realized?" he said as they stood before a wall displaying the photographs of all 47 children. Music was always supposed to be about bringing people together, about healing and hope, but I got so caught up in the business side that I forgot the spiritual side. Grace nodded, understanding what he meant. The experience in the church had changed both of them, connecting them to purposes larger than fame or wealth. My grandmother used to say that everyone has medicine to offer. Some people heal with herbs, some with music, some with stories. Your medicine is reaching people's hearts through song. These children helped you remember that. As the sun set, behind the memorial's stained glass windows, Grace felt a presence she'd come to recognize over the past few months. It was a collective spiritual energy, not the individual ghosts of the children, but something like their combined blessing on the work that had been done in their honor, standing between Justin Bieber and the vengeful spirits of the old church. Grace Campbell had called upon every protection ritual her grandmother had taught her. The millionaire pop star's life had hung in the balance, and only her spiritual knowledge had saved them both. But now, in the peaceful sanctuary of the memorial, Grace realized the real victory hadn't been winning a supernatural battle. It had been transforming a place of pain into a place of healing, turning forgotten tragedy into remembered truth, and using wealth and influence to serve justice rather than ego. The children were at peace now, their stories told and their memories honored. Grace's ancestors had guided her to this moment, and she had proven worthy of the spiritual legacy they had left her. And Justin Bieber, the young man she had protected and mentored, had grown into someone who understood that real success meant using your gifts to heal rather than harm. The memorial stood as proof that even the darkest places could be redeemed through love, courage, and the determination to ensure that the voices of the silenced would never be forgotten again.